Good morning. It's great to have you all here today. Let me start with a few housekeeping rules that we would like for you to be aware of. At this time, if you could please be present and turn your phones on silent. Restrooms are located in the lobby, visual and creative arts, and feel free to take breaks throughout the day as you need to do so. Let's talk equity. Many times, professional development opportunities like this happen outside of our college. The equity team felt that we needed to step back before we move forward. In order for us to be intentional and make transformational change, we need to be at the table and have everyone at the college at the table with us, especially those who are unable to be here today, which is our reason for actually recording today's event. With that being said, we appreciate you taking part of your day to engage in the equity conversations that we're embarking upon. I want to take a moment to give a special thank you. I'm truly blessed and thankful to have this power team as we work on equity efforts across the district, embedding transformational change, equity support for our students throughout the district, both in and outside of the classroom, establishing processes and practices that are equitable, being student-centered, collaborative, data-driven, and racially conscious, all of which we do for our college and in order to close equity gaps. Let me introduce to you my team that has helped make the symposium and all of the work that we do in OSE possible. Some are actually working on the forefront to still get people registered. We have Ivy, who is our administrative assistant. We have student assistants Olga and Dansby. We have our completions coordinator, Micah. We have our student equity coordinator, Mitra. Don is our equity tutor coordinator, as well as Micah Lynn, who is our research analyst, and unfortunately is not able to be with us today. I also want to give a special thank you to our SES committee members, our equity leads, our panelists, speakers, and volunteers that have helped us with getting today off the ground. Please join me in showing them our appreciation. Equity is not transactional. It's transformational. It's intentional. Equity is not the responsibility of one person, one office, one team. In order to make transformational change, there needs to be a shift. We need everyone to know the role they play, their responsibility, their purpose. Equity is the responsibility of everyone, the entire college, all district spaces, all stakeholders, classified staff, faculty, and administrators. We do not intend to make anyone uncomfortable today, but if you are, sit in it. Reflect and ask yourself why. What is your purpose? And if you feel comfortable, engage in a conversation with a friend or colleague during lunch about what came up for you. Our purpose is our students. Let's shift the paradigm, strengthen our college, our communication, our collaboration, and work together to make our college student ready, keeping equity at the foundation and center of our practice, and work together to close equity gaps for CCSF. Now we can start our symposium, and once again, thank you for being a part of today's festivities. Let me introduce you to our Dean of Matriculation and Counseling, Lydia Jenkins.
Good morning, everyone. First, I want to acknowledge the amazing work that Tessa Henderson-Brown does. She spends all year working tirelessly to bring us events like today's symposium, activities, and really trying to get our faculty, staff, and students to engage in the equity work here at City College of San Francisco. So thank you, Tessa. Next, it's my pleasure to introduce this morning's keynote opening speaker, Dr. J. Luke Wood. Dr. Wood is the Associate Vice President for Faculty Diversity and Inclusion and Distinguished Professor of Education at San Diego State University. Formerly, Dr. Wood served as the Director of the Joint Ph.D. program in education between San Diego State University and Claremont Graduate University, as well as the director of the Ed.D. program in community college leadership. He also serves as the co-director of the Community College Equity Assessment Lab, SEAL, a national research and practice center that partners with community colleges to support their capacity in advancing outcomes for underserved students of color. SEAL houses the National Consortium on College Men of Color, which hosts training, information sharing sessions, and provides resources to colleges with initiatives and programs supporting college men of color. We are excited this morning to have Dr. Wood here at City College. Please join me in welcoming him to the stage. Dr. Wood.
So it's a pleasure to be back here. I was here not that long ago and had an opportunity to speak with a number of individuals who are participating in one of the programs that we're doing as partnership with the institution, focused on the various certificate programs, teaching men of color, supporting men of color, microaggressions, implicit bias, and so that was a fun session to be able to do kind of some Q&A around. I want to begin by thanking Tessa Brown Henderson for the incredible support and the work that she's doing and the work that your campus is doing to really try to advance equity. And I realize that there's a lot that's been going on. It hasn't been a slow pace as of late. There's a lot that the office, your Office of Diversity has been leading in equity. But there's also a lot that's going on across the state. And so we're going to talk about how we can advance beyond where we're at right now. And in some ways, advancing where we're at beyond right now and going further than what we've been able to do is really a function of going back to the basics. I think that if we look across the state, there's been an incredible focus on structural changes and an incredible number of initiatives. What are some of the initiatives that are taking place right now? Some of the new initiatives around equity or old initiatives? New funding formula, what else? AB 705, RISE, Guided Pathways. Anything else? Say what? California Promise. So those are just a few, and we could probably sit here and come up with 5 more, right? So there's a lot that's going on. So how do we make sure that when we get to the end of all of this, that we've actually been effective in reaching our equity goals? I had a chance to look at some of the data for this institution, looking at success rates from their 2005 cohort, which would have finished in 2010, 2011, to the most recent cohort. And I saw an interesting pattern in the data. The first pattern that I saw was that overall, there has been actually some changes in equity in terms of student performance outcomes. The biggest change that's been evident is that over the past number of years, in terms of that time frame, again with the beginning with your cohort that ended in 2010, 2011 to now, is that equity gaps have decreased for your female students but they've increased for most of your male students. And then if you start to look further, you can see other disaggregations about certain groups that even within that or within certain subgroups that looks different than what you might expect. And I think that the overall takeaway that I had when I was looking at the data in preparation for this is that this is a campus that's put a lot of effort into trying to improve equity outcomes, and the results have been mixed. And the results are oftentimes mixed when we see that there is an intentional focus on structures, an intentional focus on practices, but maybe there's more work to be done sometimes around perceptions. And so because of that, that's why I wanted to focus on, again, going back to basics for this morning. So just quickly, I think many of you, first of all, who here has had an opportunity to engage me in a different session before? Okay, so a few folks. So as a result, I'll kind of plug through this first part real quick. Just a little bit about me and the center. So my name is Luke, as was mentioned. I have the opportunity of serving at San Diego State in a few different capacities. I serve as our Chief Diversity Officer and Associate Vice President for Academic Affairs. I also have been on the faculty since 2011, and for the past 5 or 6 years, up until now, have been running our EDD program in community college leadership. I'm a community college researcher. I started out working in community colleges, actually at Sacramento City College, farther north from here, and then with the Maricopa system, and have had some really important, I think, experiences that have helped to inform the work that we're doing around equity. I also happen to serve as a co-director for a center at San Diego State called the Community College Equity Assessment Lab with my colleague Frank Harris III. So you'll hear me say "we" several times throughout this presentation, and "we" is really just being encompassing of the fact that it's not really just myself doing this work, but a whole host of individuals, including myself, my colleague Frank, my colleague Marissa, our doctoral students, and so I think that's important to mention. So we do a lot of work in terms of survey work with students. Looks like some of the translation between the different computers has that little survey thing on the bottom, so that may be a theme throughout this. But we have different surveys. One is a student survey, one is a faculty survey, one is a staff survey. We do tons of focus groups and interviews with students. And through all these different things, we found a number of patterns that we find to be concerning. One, we find in our quantitative data that students oftentimes feel unwelcome to engage when they're from minoritized backgrounds. Not that they don't want to engage, but they feel unwelcome to do so because of the climates and conditions that have been created on our campuses. And from our qualitative work, when we delve deeper into why that is, one of the primary reasons is microaggressions. And so there are very subtle things that we oftentimes do, totally accidental sometimes and sometimes not, but more oftentimes unintentional, that can influence success outcomes. So that's why it's important for us to get back to the basics and think about what that means for us. So as was mentioned, there's a lot of different initiatives that are taking place. One is the Chancellor's Vision for Success, right? And you can see some of the goals for that: increase by 20% associate degree certificates, prep for in-demand jobs, by increased transfer by 35%. And the strategy for getting there are 7 core commitments. A number of them are things that I think that most people ideologically would agree with are important: focusing relentlessly on students and goals, designing things with students in mind rather than with ourselves in mind, which can always be difficult because as educators, we have so many things on our plates that we oftentimes end up prioritizing what we need, and that doesn't always translate into what our students need. And a number of other commitments. In addition to that, there's of course AB 705, right, which was already mentioned, which is a very high-level, intensive intervention that has been put forth through policy that is really based upon a lot of work that's been done through the acceleration projects, and really has shown us that that students who have been coming into our community colleges who have been placed far below basic have not been doing well. And so really reconceptualizing how we engage students at those entry points and doing it in a way that brings them into college level work at a significantly faster pace. Now, one of the challenges with this initiative has not been the initiative itself, but been the response of some educators who, when they see efforts like this, may perceive that what equity means is that we're lowering quality, that we're putting students in our classes in front of us who may not be as ready to engage the work as we think they should be, or may not have even the capability of doing so. That's been the common theme when we go from campus to campus, that there will be at least a contingent of educators who feel that way. In fact, if you've ever heard someone say something to that effect, raise your hand. Okay, so lots of our hands are going up. And I think from our perspective, what we've seen across all of our work in dealing with equity is that equity is never about lowering quality. Increasing student outcomes isn't about lowering quality, it's about raising quality. And part of that raising quality is raising the quality of what we're bringing to the table as educators. And too often what we do is and I say we because I'm an educator too, and sometimes we can also I can also fall into this pattern where we look at differences and outcomes and we think that it is really a function of students, their families, their communities, or their commitments, without recognizing that instead of focusing on remediating students, we really need to be focused on remediating ourselves and better preparing ourselves to engage a population that many of us never dreamed that we would be engaging. And so when we look at all the different large-scale changes that are taking place, guided pathways, very important. Taking students and creating meta major opportunities, thinking about onboarding, how we're going to make sure that they get what they need, integrated planning, AB 705, early alerts, which have in some places really got off the ground and in some places haven't made much movement at all. The Promise program, new funding formula, and really the central thing that we have to recognize, and no matter what we're doing around these initiatives, is that all of these initiatives have the potential to do more damage than good if equity is not at the center of them. If equity is not at the center of them, then we can do what the data from this campus has shown has been done before, which is that outcomes can increase for some of our students, but not all of our students. And oftentimes the students who our outcomes don't increase for are those who are from the most minoritized communities. And so that's why oftentimes when I hear educators use the phraseology that a rising tide lifts all boats, these efforts, what we're going to do is that, we're going to increase success for everyone. And we're going to do interventions that benefit everyone, and that is going to improve outcomes. And the truth is that when we look closer at the data, that we find that a rising tide does not lift all boats. And there's some reasons for that. Sometimes we have boats that are simply in bad condition because of racism and systemic oppression. We have boats that aren't in the water because they're not being touched by our services or the resources of the people on campus. We have boats that are on fire because of challenges such as food insecurity and housing insecurity. So a rising tide does not lift all boats, and in fact, the data oftentimes shows that the boats that are in the best condition are the boats that rise the fastest. And so I think that's something for us to keep in mind, because when we're looking at these initiatives, they all have the potential, as I said, to do great opportunities for our students, but they can do more damage than good. And we can see a situation that if equity is not at the center of what we are doing, that guided pathways can simply be guided tracking, because we onboard students into majors that we think are appropriate for their level of ability. Integrated planning can be, I don't know, what's the opposite of integrated? It can be decentralized, dispersed, right, planning, where we're not really being as intentional as we need to be. The Promise program, we can oftentimes have programs that provide great opportunities, but the students who oftentimes benefit from those programs are not our most minoritized students. They're students who are in the middle. And too often what we do, again, is that we focus on structures without getting down to the basics. And what's the basics? The basics is here on this slide here. This is what we call our pyramid of success. And at the base of our pyramid are perceptions, how we view students and how we view our roles as educators. Our perceptions influence how we relate with our students. They influence the relationships that we have. If I have perceptions that views a certain student community as being academically capable, as being moral, as being committed to the work that they're doing, if those are my perceptions of the students I'm engaging, the way that I relate with them is going to be very different than if I think they come from communities that are lesser than, if I think that they're uncommitted to the work that they're doing, if I don't think that they belong. And so we think that perceptions influences relationships, and relationships are essential because relationships that are typified by trust, mutual respect, and authentic care can translate into better outcomes for our students when we're intentional about doing so. And then, of course, how we relate with students then influences the strategies and practices that we use, which then ultimately influences our structures. But so often we start with structures at that very top, and we forget that the people who are engaging all of these systems, all of these practices, all of these initiatives have perceptions that are oftentimes rooted in stereotypical perceptions of the students they're engaging. And even the most strongest of equity champions, everyone, even those individuals, still has groups and individuals that they need to work on. We all have work to do because equity involves us creating a better environment for everyone. And in order to create a better environment for everyone, we have to be intentional about focusing on students who are experiencing disproportionate impact, both in terms of their outcomes and their experiences at our institutions. So there's a lot of things that can derail equity. Here are just a few of them. One is a culture of complacency. I've been here for 30 years. We've always done it this way. Why do we need to change it? It's worked. Some people believe that. Culture of complacency. We can have deficit perspectives that blame students, their families, and their communities. One of the common themes that we hear in our qualitative work with faculty at other institutions is when they get into the equity work is to perceive that it's lowering standards, or the students don't really care. Some of them are really just here for the financial aid anyhow. A lack of data transparency, not being as intentional as we need to be about focusing on our data and the equity gaps within our data. It's real easy to talk about what needs to be done, but it's a lot harder to do that when you're looking at your data and then you're asked the question, what are you doing to contribute to this? Misappropriation and lack of intentionality, taking equity funds and using them for things that are important, but maybe commitments that we already had and we're just trying to use existing funding to fund things that are being underfunded in other areas. Siloing and marginalization. This perspective that, you know what, equity, that's Tessa's job. That's not our job, that's Tessa's job, right? That is a perspective that I am sure that some people on this campus have. That equity belongs with EOP&S, it belongs with Puente, it belongs with our support programs, it belongs with our outreach programs, it involves these groups over here, but it doesn't involve me. And here's the truth. The truth is that equity and diversity cut across every area of this campus. Every area. Let me give you an example of what that looks like for me at San Diego State. I came into my role in August as serving as our Associate Vice President for Academic Affairs, and my specific area being equity, diversity, inclusion. The campus has had a hard time trying to identify, okay, so what actually is in Luke's role? Because what doesn't touch equity? Enrollment, equity is an issue there. Curriculum and development, equity is an issue there. Faculty advancement, equity is an issue there. Staff support, equity is an issue there. You can't really think of a single area that equity and diversity don't touch. And so as a result, the campus has had me leading our strategic plan for the campus. We're redoing our admissions process, and so we're taking the lead on that. Training and development, we're taking the lead on that. And I got to the point where there were so many things that were being put on my plate that I started to say, but wait a second, don't they have a responsibility for equity too? Not just because it was in my self-interest to not have to be at work until 10 o'clock every night, but also because in order for us to do it right, every single one of us has to have the commitment to believe that it's our responsibility as well. And here's just some different quotes to help to paint the picture about what that means, right? Complacency. Why do we have to do this? Nothing's going to change. The problem is so much bigger than us. It's bigger than me. Instability. We had a VP of instruction who was equity champion, but she left to be president at another college. Poor conceptualization. Let's just be honest. Equity really means lowering standards and rigor. Or exceptionalism. We aren't like other colleges in the state. We have the highest transfer rates to the UC, so we don't need to worry about equity. We hear statements like this across our system. These aren't things I made up, these are real. In fact, everything that you see in this presentation, these quotes are real things that people say to us as part of the work that we do. So I'm going to skirt through this really quickly because it's not the focus of the presentation, but I just want to mention that on the bottom right-hand side, we also have toxic resistance and toxic support. That's also a derailment to our equity efforts. And this is just a quick diagram that we use to break educators out into how we want to think about reaching different populations with different motivations, realizing that whenever we have a crowd, whenever we have a group of people, that we can't assume that everybody has the same perspective, but rather that there are different people with different motivations. We have those that know what to do and those that have a willingness to do it, and then there's the intersection of that, because you can know what to do and be willing to do it, but you can also know what to do and not be doing it, and you can also not know what to do and not be doing it as well, right? Which is just as bad. So when we look at these different groups, we break them up into a taxonomy that refers to the choir, the allies, the resistors, and the defiant. The choir are those that know what to do, they know the strategies and practices that are necessary, and they're doing them. It's a very important group. But not everyone is choir. We also have a lot of people who are allies. Those are individuals who they don't know what to do. They're committed to equity, they're committed to social justice, but they have to learn how to work with, say, men of color or our LGBT population or our students who experience food and housing insecurity or our undocumented students. So they have to learn, but they have a willingness to do so. So the bridge between them being allies to choir is knowledge and information. Then we have those that are resistors. And we break resistors out into two different categories, but the tying thing between those two different categories is they don't know what to do and they're not doing it. So don't know and not doing it. And we kind of, again, break that into two groups. One is active resistors who are very vocal and very oppositional and will make sure that you know that they don't believe in these efforts. And then for the most of those who are resistors, they're actually what we call passive resistors. I also kind of refer to them as the unmoved, who they know that some of these things are going on, they just choose not to do anything about it, or they can be just totally unaware, but again, there's no motivation for them to change. But how they vote is with their lack of participation, they just stay out of things. Passive resistors represent a large contingent on most campuses, and so we want to make sure that they're part of the conversation as well. And then there's the defiant. These are people who know what to do, but they choose not to. And we can all know what to do and choose not to, right? Like, for example, we know certain things with our health that we should do. Like, I know that I should be eating certain things, right? I have that knowledge, but I don't do it. I know how to work out, but I don't always do it, right? I know how I should be supporting my students, but sometimes because of all the different things that happen every day that are on my plate, sometimes I just don't do it. And then there's the last group, which I thought is, of course, important for today, is the oblivious. The people who fall in the center, those who think they know what to do and really don't. Those who have a savior complex, who it's about saving students who can't make it on their own. And in that reality, it's about bringing deficit perspectives about those students to equity work. Those who are non-reflective, who can use the right words, say the right things. They know that, hey, if I'm engaging students, maybe I should use gender-inclusive language and say Latinx as opposed to Latino. Maybe I should use pronouns. Maybe I should refer to equity as opposed to equality because those are different concepts. So they know what to do, right? They have the knowledge, but what they say and what they do are totally removed from one another because there's no action that's associated with it. Then there's the third group of those oblivious, and those are individuals who are not necessarily non-reflective, but more so grandstanders. So they're doing it about their own image. They're doing this because it's important for people to be able to see them doing this because it's good for their reputation, but that's not necessarily what we need to be committed to doing. implicit bias and microaggressions, because that's what I really want to get to, is talking about the kind of micro level ways in which we engage one another and how that influences our students and their success. So in terms of implicit bias, we're referring to the attitudes and stereotypes that all of us have. We have certain assumptions and perceptions about groups that are different from us. They're the attitudes that we have that are informed by traces of past experience, which are really based upon our earliest and most salient experiences. So think about the images that you have from when you were young, things you saw on television, interactions that you had with family members or friends. The messages that you received, whether they were overt messages and things that people verbalized, or the nonverbal body language communicated to you and to me at an early age, that there are certain people that we should extol, and there's certain people who are lesser than. And that implicit bias is not something that influences me only, but every single one of us in here. Every single one of us in here have biases, and every single one of us communicate those biases on a daily basis to one another. But there also happen to be certain groups that are more likely to be the recipients of those biases. We can look at individuals who are people of color. We can look at our LGBT community. We can look at women. We can look at individuals who experience food and housing insecurities. We can look at the intersections of all of those and then find groups that are even more likely to experience these challenges. Now, in our work, we essentially perceive that there are three primary stereotypes that are facing our students. The three primary stereotypes we collectively refer to as distrust, disdain, and disregard. Distrust, which are assumptions of criminality. When we view students as being criminal, as being deviant, as having some sort of malintent. Now, oftentimes it's not done in a way that's overt, but it's done in a very subtle way, where let's say that I'm engaging my class, and this is my class. Class has ended, students are coming up to me. I have students approaching me from all different vantage points, and let's say that there is a taller, darker-skinned Latino male who walks up. I catch a periphery view of him, and I step back just a little bit, because I've been taught to provide a little bit of extra distance between myself and this individual, because this is someone who I should fear. That same student is likely, when they go into the library, people look around and question, why are they here? What are they doing? Are they here to steal something? When they're on campus at nighttime, they may be asked for their ID more often than the other students, and that is distrust. Disdain is when we view certain communities as being lesser than because we pathologize their cultures and their values. Think about it as the they statements. Tell me if you've ever heard any of these statements. They're lazy. They don't care. They're not really committed. They're not here for school. They're just here for the financial aid. These are perspectives that are very common. And these are perspectives that we also know are communicated to our students on a daily basis. And then the third one is disregard. And disregard really refers to our ascriptions of intelligence when we assume that individuals are academically inferior compared to us and compared to other individuals from other racial ethnic groups simply because of their race. So with that, we want to think about microaggressions, right? So what are the ways in which we communicate these three stereotypes? Well, there's a lot of different ways. And one of the big ways that we do through is microaggressions. Now, microaggressions, as you can see here, are the kind of brief and commonplace daily verbal, behavioral, environmental indignities, whether intentional or unintentional, that communicate hostile, derogatory, or negative racial slights and insults towards people of color. Think about it as the subtle things that we say, the subtle things that we do, that we're oftentimes unaware of, that either insult or invalidate people's experiences. Now, the truth is, there's actually one other type of microaggression that's not talked about as much, and that's kind of the more old school direct forms of racism. You know, we've had at my own institution a number of different incidents that are direct examples of direct racism. Someone being called the N-word, that's not microaggressive in the contemporary way, it's a micro assault. We kind of all know what to do with that one, right? That's in the racism box, everyone agree? All right. Okay, so we can see that there are very specific things that people can do and people can say, but microaggressions are oftentimes conceptualized as the more subtle things. So where I grew up in far, far, far Northern California. So people say Northern California in San Diego, and they think that this is Northern California, but I'm from Mount Shasta. So So when I think about Northern California, I think like far north, like north of the wall in a Game of Thrones context, if anybody's watching, since we're getting towards the end of this. Yes, we're the wildlings. So up where I'm from, people would just say to you directly how they felt. There was none of this kind of like ambiguity, like person calls you into your face. Well, okay, that's not my friend. Real easy to place that. But what happens when you're engaging someone and the messages are much more subtle, which is more common, and you don't really know, is it me? Is it them? Is it something I said? Why are they saying these things to me? And you start becoming and thinking it's about you and something that you've done yourself. Now, this is what happens with most of us. Most of us, when we experience microaggressions, right, and let's say that we bring it to the person's attention. So let's say that we're the recipient of this. We bring these messages to a person's attention. Most people aren't going to say, I'm sorry for microaggressing you. You know what, next time I'm going to do differently because I'm committed to student success and Has anyone ever heard someone say that? Okay. We usually don't say that. What we do is we stick with our human nature, which is to protect ourselves. So I make a mistake, my response isn't to own that mistake. It's instead to say, well, you misunderstood me, or you're overreacting. So we either explain it away, we become defensive, or sometimes we even accuse others of offending us because they brought race to the table. Like, oh, well, you said that I microaggressed you and you brought up race, so isn't that racist? And people go down these weird paths. But ultimately, the reason for that, the reason that most people have a challenge in owning up to it is really because we're taught that we all like to think of ourselves as good, caring, and ethical people. We all like to think of ourselves as good people doing good work. And so what happens if I say something that harms somebody and that conflicts with this identity that I have in my mind about what I'm here to do? And we think that that's a normal process for people to go through. So what we like to say is being biased doesn't make you bad, it makes you human. All of us are biased, and all of us are human in this room. That's an important statement to say that all of us are human, because not everyone believes that. But knowing that we have biases and choosing not to do anything about it, that is what's bad. So that's where we have to put the onus of our work. Now, what we're going to do is we're going to go through some examples of implicit bias, and some specifically how they play out with microaggressions. I'm going to give you some examples of these different types of microaggressions, and then we're going to look at a couple scenarios. And I want to really engage us as an audience today, a little bit more interactive than we might normally do, and how might we respond to these things when they occur. Okay, so addressing microaggressions, what we're going to be looking at is one specific type of microaggression, and that's those that are verbal and public. Think about those that are verbal and public, because there's all kinds of microaggressions. They can be environmental, so they can be the images that are on the walls, the way that we structure institutions. Let me give you quick examples. Environmental, at SDSU we have our faculty and staff club, and there are 14 images of SDSU's history throughout this faculty and staff club. Pictures of the founding of the institution, of important leadership in student government, images of students studying, but it's key images. Most of them are in black and white throughout their entire faculty and staff club. The only two images of students of color are in the two breakout rooms, and there's only two images, and both of those images are of students who are athletes. That's an example of an environmental microaggression, right? Another example can be a campus that, let's say, has a satellite institution, right? We have a smaller campus that's over in another specific area, and maybe it's in a community that's maybe serves a high percentage of people of color, and then so we provide maybe less funding for that than we do for other institutions, and we think about the faculty members and colleagues that work there as being different from us and not as good as us. That can be an environmental way in which this plays out. Right? So environmentals can be both verbal and nonverbal, but what we're talking about is the public things. And the key example here is saying to someone, wow, you're so articulate. Now, not that anyone should ever speak on behalf of all people of color or all people from another group. That should never happen. But in this one case, I'm going to say that all of us people of color in here have at one point in time heard something to this effect, or something pretty similar. We have heard that, wow, you're so articulate. Didn't expect you to know that. Hey, and this, not only is it said with a sense of trying to compliment us, but there's oftentimes an intention to there being positive. They're wanting to uplift us, but in reality, because of the stereotypical views that they have, they're actually what Daryl Wing Sue refers to as damning compliments. We're saying things that are meant to be compliments, but they're actually hurtful, right? The key difference is, of course, that saying it with a sense of surprise. You can tell someone they're articulate, right? But it's when you say it with that sense of surprise, like you didn't expect them to be. It's like, wow, you're so articulate. My response oftentimes when I hear that is, wow, so are you. And then watch the reaction, and then people start to think, oh, and it helps them to come to a realization. So what are the messages that we receive when we tell people these microaggressions? Well, here's the thing. It's not about what's said, it's about what's really said. And if you do the online program that we have in microaggressions, you're gonna get some of this, but that program goes much more in depth than we're covering here. But basically, there's what's said and what's really said. What's said, wow, you're so articulate. What's really said, I didn't expect you to be. What's said, or what's not said in that classroom exchange where, again, my class says dismissed students are coming up. I have a student who comes up in my periphery view. I step back and give myself a little bit more space. What may be said in my mind is I'm giving myself a little bit more space, but what's really said is you're a criminal or you're dangerous, right? So it's the real true message that's being sent. And there's all different types of microaggressions, and don't worry, we're not covering all of them today. But there are some ones that are some pretty key ones that we have to keep in mind when we're talking about our most minoritized students. Again, ascriptions of intelligence, when we assume that individuals are academically inferior. Assumptions of criminality, where we assume that they're dangerous, deviant, up to no good. Second-class citizens, when we treat individuals as being lesser than. Pathologizing culture, again, the they statements, they don't care, they're lazy. It's about their communities, their families, their communication styles, their cultures. Different norming. This is one that I had a real pleasure of learning about when I used to live in the South. And that's when people would tell me that I was a credit to my race. And I didn't totally get at the point. At first I thought it was a compliment because it was said by a colleague. And then I started thinking about it. I was like, wait a second, that wasn't really a compliment. Right? And I'll give you some more specific examples that may be more real everyday ones. Athletic aboundedness is when we perceive that our students, and we see them through this lens of being athletes. They can't be possibly anything else. By the way, if we were to go by what people tell you, then I'm just going to let everyone know that I'm a famous athlete. Because everywhere I go, people ask me if I am one. So I just decided that I'm a famous athlete. I have no athletic bone in my body. I have an identical twin brother, by the way, who is very athletic. That wasn't cool in high school, being the one that wasn't. But there's this assumption that when you see people of color, that either their worth or their positionality on this campus is associated with that. Outsider on campus, when we treat people as being from the outside, when they're our students or our colleagues. And colorblindness, when we assume that we don't see color. We treat everyone the same. We're all part of the same race, the human race. Some examples. Ascriptions of intelligence. The big one. Wow, you're so articulate. Assigning a degree of intelligence to a person of color based on their race. We find that oftentimes the first day of classes, or when a lot of these will occur, usually an educator who's trying to be very supportive of students. Student comes into class, and let's say this is a math class or a science class, and they don't look like the typical student that I have in my class, and so I want to make sure that they get to the right location. And so as they're walking in, I say, are you sure that this is the right class? You know, this is Calculus 202. or some other number. And when we do that, oftentimes the intention is to be helpful, but the message that's received by students is that I didn't belong here. That happens a lot. We find that when we see that our students break up into group projects with our students of color, that they're the last to be picked, and in many cases they're not picked at all. We find it to be particularly salient with our men of color, where they'll say that, you know, they'll break into groups and no one wants to work with me, and then when they do, they roll their eyes, or it's a sense of reluctance, and they communicated that they didn't think that I was capable of doing the work. In fact, in my doctoral program, when I was running the doctoral program, I had a group of African American doctoral students, highest level of education, come to talk with me because they were concerned with the fact that nobody wanted to work with them on group projects in a doctoral program focused on equity. Just saying. Assumptions of criminality, assuming that a person of color is dangerous, criminal, or deviant based upon their race. So clutching a purse or wallet, following students around the campus bookstore, checking their IDs at nighttime. Second-class citizenship, treating people as lesser than, mistaking people on campus for service workers, and there is absolutely nothing wrong with being a service worker. In fact, those have been great opportunities for people from my community. But if I look at a student and I assume that automatically they must be because that's what I perceive service workers to be, then maybe there's something wrong with my conceptualization of this institution. Overlooking a student of color at a student services counter to attend to a different student, a white student, happens all the time. Pathologizing culture, I already mentioned it's the they statements. Different norming. When I was talking about those blacks, I wasn't really talking about you. I don't think of you as Asian. You're not like the rest of them. You're different. You work hard. Why can't all minorities be like you? That's obviously a little bit more direct. But actually where this comes from is actually the literature in middle school, where at that point in time, teachers start providing a greater level of emphasis on certain students. And what happens when you have a student who, in general, for their community, you have low expectations, but for this one student, there's something about them that just resonates with you. You want to pour yourself into them, but you have to, in your mind, somehow separate them from the rest of them. And so what they talk about is the conflict that these students have when their teachers build them up while simultaneously tearing down their communities and creating these really major identity conflicts. Athletic boundedness. You look like a ball player. What sport do you play? One of the best examples I have of this is I had an opportunity to go and do a training on implicit bias for the U.S. Department of Education. And I've done that several times under the Obama administration and one time under the Trump administration. My invitation came under the Obama administration, and then I went to do the training under the Trump administration to the Department of Ed. Let's just say that was interesting, training on implicit bias. But I went there, and you know what? I found that people were, the people who came to the room at least, right, it was voluntary, but the people who came to the room were actually open to the ideas. And I was like, okay, that's great. Felt like it was good training. Get on the plane, head home, and it's a Southwest flight, land in Phoenix. And then Phoenix is gonna take me to San Diego. On the plane, people are getting off the plane, some people are getting on. They tell us, hey, feel free to stand up, stretch your legs, it's gonna be a few minutes before we get going again. I stand up, gentleman in front of me stands up. I'm wearing a college sweater from one of my favorite community colleges. I like to rep community colleges that are doing great work. I was wearing a college sweater, and he turns around and looks at me, this gentleman standing in front of me, older white male, and he says, what do you do? And I started to respond saying, I'm a professor at San Diego State. I teach research stats. This is, I started going to all those different things. And he says, oh, no. And I could tell that he wanted to guess. So I'm like, okay, let's let him guess. So he says, so what do you do? And I said, well, and I started to say it. And he says, oh, wait, let me see. Basketball player. And I'm thinking to myself, no. He says, oh, and then he had this look of bewilderment on his face, like, oh, well, he's not big enough to be a football player, but I guess. So, oh, football. I said, no, I'm a professor. And the look of amazement on his eyes, you should have seen it. He didn't know what to say. He didn't know what to do. And he just said, oh, okay, that's nice. And so, of course, I'm a little chapped, but I'm just like, you know what? I'm going home. And so I say, what do you do? And he says, well, I'm a professor at, I'm not going to say the institution. And I thought, wow, if that's the perception that he has of someone who is clearly not a community college athlete, then what is his perceptions of the students he's engaging? Outsider on campus, can I help you? What building are you looking for? May I see your ID? Totally fine if we're trying to help people, but not if we think that they don't belong or they're here on our campus because maybe they're just wandering around. Colorblindness, I don't see color. America's a melting pot. There's only one race, the human race. And so there's a lot of different ways in which we do these things. And so what I want to do is have you, and if you actually have a camera, please take a picture of this particular slide here. This is our Raven approach. This is can we respond to these things when they occur, right? Because we got to know what to do. So we have to engage in this process. First, redirect. Let's say that there's an instance that takes place, a witness a microaggression that occurs. We have to first redirect because we have to stop harm from occurring, right? Let's ground this in a specific example. The professor was facilitating a conversation on police brutality. It was a difficult discussion because there were people in the room who had personally experienced challenges with law enforcement and others who felt that the conversation was disparaging police officers. During the conversation, one student said out loud, "There are certain communities that are more likely to commit crime. I'm sorry, but the truth is, and I'm not trying to be racist, but some Black and Latino communities are dangerous. Come on, we all know that Hunter's Point isn't as nice as Nob Hill. Just watch the news. So yeah, I'm not totally surprised that there are more issues with police in those bad communities." It's just an example. Now this is a real example for somewhere else. We switched in some different things. But think about this. How would you address this? You're the faculty member in this classroom. This just occurred. What do you do? Well, this step process. You have to redirect because there's harm that's occurred. There's a message that's been rendered that could be hurtful to students in the class. So you have to intervene immediately. You have to correct. You have to pull aside. Why? To stop the harm from continuing. And what that looks like is going to differ based upon how many people are around, what the context is. But the first thing is you have to redirect. You have to intervene. Then we're an educational institution. The best way to help people come to an understanding of things is to ask them questions. So I think I heard you say that X place is a bad community. Bad. What do you mean by bad? Let them sit with that for a moment. Oftentimes, the initial response will be to backtrack. Well, I don't really mean bad. What I really mean is, and people will start to try to back it up, or sometimes they'll go full in. Well, it is bad, and here's why. And then that's also an opportunity to talk about things, but using it as an opportunity to ask questions. Then, values clarification. You know, at this institution, we are committed to diversity and inclusion. We believe that all of our students are valued, and as a result, I think we should be mindful in moving forward about the language we use in class. Or even better, who here has rules or ground rules for their classes that they use in terms of engagement? A couple hands go up. For those of you who have ground rules for your class, you just bring it back to the classroom ground rules. But always bring it back to the value system that we think is important, right? Because it's not just about the knowledge that students gain. It's not just about the skills that they gain. It's also about the dispositions, right? Then emphasizing your own thoughts and feelings. You know, when I hear you say that bad community, I think this, or I think people from that community might feel X way, right? But bringing it down to emphasizing thoughts and feelings as a way of trying to change perception. And then finally, next steps, action. So telling people, so in the future, do this, right? As a directive way of doing it. Or also then being intentional about harm reduction. So if there's this message that's been put out there that this community is bad, right? And people from my class are from that community, and that's a hurtful message, then what do I have to do? I have to counter message that message throughout the rest of the next coming weeks in order to counterbalance what has been said. Why? Because when people come with distrust, disdain, and disregard, we have to come with extolling students' brilliance, dignity, and morality. We have to message the opposite direction. So again, redirect, ask questions, clarify values, emphasize your thoughts and feelings, and then next steps. So take a moment with the person sitting next to you and talk about how would you address this specific scenario using this approach. You're going to take just 2 minutes to talk amongst one another, and then we're going to have a mic that's going to go around, and I want to hear just what are some ways in which we can, using this framework, address some of these issues. Okay, let's bring it in. So, first thing, before you talk about just one of the things or two of the things that you could do that might have come up, and you can pick any of the, you don't have to go through the whole thing, just pick what are some of the things you could say in any of those areas. First of all, I want people to tell me what type of microaggression or microaggressions do you see here? I heard an assumption of criminality from somewhere. Okay. Why is that?
They're assuming that people in that neighborhood are more prone to commit crime.
Okay. Anything else? Pathologizing? Why is that?
I mean, because there's stuff in here targeted at specific communities, Black and Latino. So
Yep.
saying that because they are that, they are this.
Perfect. And you've seen that in terms of those that are highlighted in red or marked in red, those are primary ones. Now, in every scenario, important to realize that there's usually more than one microaggression, and I'm just getting some of the bigger ones. People can read through and probably identify other things that are in there. Did you have one that you saw? Oh, yeah, absolutely. See, there's another one that's in there. Okay, so who would like to, anybody, just raise your hand and we have a mic right here. How would you address this scenario using this approach? What are some things that you might do? Wow, we got this, huh?
It's funny, you don't look Mexican. My response, what does a Mexican look like? Are you talking about the Indian side of me, the African influence that came from southern Spain, blah, 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 blah. And
Okay, so asking, using that as a probing question to try to have them come to a realization that what they said was offensive. Yeah, that's a great way of handling it. What else? So in a perfect context, we'd be doing all these steps, but in reality, you know, things look different in when we're on the go, right? So thinking about what would you pull from for right now? I think, did you?
Well, I was just going to say in our group, we kind of started to say, like, what is the redirect? And what is the redirect? And when is it appropriate to, when and what is appropriate in this redirect and the probing questions? And, you know, it was, at least in our threesome here, we were discussing, like, at what point do we make this intentional, and also what exactly, like, maybe we need practice with this, right? Mm-hmm. So that's why we didn't have the answer, but we're putting it out there. Like, I think we need practice with this. So maybe when do we role play? How do we address that beyond this 2-minute exercise? Yep,
absolutely. And that was actually the last thing I was going to say, but since you brought it up, what I have for you is in this PowerPoint that I'm going to be giving to Tessa. It has this scenario as well as a whole bunch of other scenarios. And I also have an attachment that's a role play document that you could use if you want to do it in your departments that's not using scenarios, but you actually would have like 3 people and they would act out a specific thing and then talk about. So this is really just meant to be kind of an initial kind of introduction to this. So, but thank you for bringing that up. Anybody else?
I just had a question tagged on, which is how much, you know, because once you start going down this path, if you don't do it well, you can really mess things up or leave them unfinished, and you know what I mean? You open up a can of everything. So how do you figure out how much time you spend versus what you had on your lesson plan and whether to do it or not do it.
I think it depends upon the severity of what's said and how it's received. If the severity is high, then I think you have to address it with more time. If the severity is lower, you still have to address it, because not addressing it is allowing harm to continue. But I would say that the level of what you would do that with might look different. And it may look, if it's at a smaller scale, pulling maybe 2 students aside during a work group time rather than doing it for the full class. But I do agree that you could do more damage than good if you don't practice with it first. Yeah. Go ahead. And then we're going to go over here.
Hi. So I have an actual real life situation, and it's a little bit unique. So I just wanted to put it out there because we were discussing it because we kind of know about it together. We work together. So I work on apprenticeship programs that have a lot of complex partnerships with city agencies, with other community-based organizations, the school. And the real life situation is that I have a young queer woman of color that has been experiencing homelessness for 9 years. And we have a senior city partner who made the comment, well, she's not really homeless, she's housing challenged. And my thing is like, I hear that right away and I'm like, this is problematic. But the person that's the city official is an older woman of color. And me as I'm trying to hold space, and there's this politics and trying to be respectful. And as a white man, how much do I, assert my ideas of social justice on somebody from an oppressed community? But then we were dialoguing around this, and I'm like, oh gosh, but me being silent and worrying about how I'm going to show up, am I perpetuating the injustice? So that's just like what the real thing is.
Yeah.
And I don't know that we have the answer on how to deal with that, but just realizing that I've been silencing myself with this person because they don't have as nuanced, right heart, absolute right intentions, but doesn't have the nuanced understanding of, I think, how this particular oppression is affecting the student.
Absolutely. And I think that before you get to your point too, I think that we have to understand that there is a difference between intent and impact. You can have a good intent and still have a bad impact. In fact, more often than not, we have good intent and bad impact. In terms of that specific scenario, I actually do think that asking questions is meant to be a way of addressing it without being confrontational. Because what we don't want to do is shut people down, but we have to address it, right? Because harm has been done. So one way that you could say is like, well, what was the phraseology that she said it's not housing?
She's not really homeless, she's just housing challenged.
Okay, great. So what do you mean by housing challenge? That there's nothing there that is offensive, but you're now asking questions, and then you can continue to ask questions in a way that tries to then bring them to a realization that maybe what they said could have been hurtful. Yeah.
And I just wanted to add that this is a great approach because one of the biggest problems with microaggressions is that we let them go.
Yeah, we can't.
You have to stop and redirect and start the conversation. I don't know if you've heard about the Bystander Project.
Yep.
Yeah, this is very similar.
Yeah, it is. In fact, how you would address, actually, if you look at both the taxonomy that I presented and this, there's a very strong alignment with how we do both bystander training and stuff around bullying. Both of those 2 different areas. Yeah. All right, or upstander. So before we get to the next person, let's use 2 more minutes. I know we're getting close on time, but to engage a different scenario. All right, how about this one? No, that one's too simple. How about this one? Luis, who identifies as Native American and is on staff in the library, was asked to do a presentation on a new computer use policy that they have developed. At the conclusion of the presentation, Eric, another library staff person, raised his hand to ask a question. Before asking the question, Eric said to Luis in a complimentary and enthusiastic tone, "Wow, Luis, I was so impressed by your presentation. I had no idea how articulate and smart you are." Other librarians around the table were similarly surprised. They also affirmed him, saying, "Yeah, you're so amazing." And the one person said, "Not what we expected."
Oh.
So, in your group, with the person next to you, identify 1, what type of microaggressions occurred, and 2, how you might address it. Just so you know, this is a real one. The only thing that I added to it was the last phrase, not what we expected, so it would touch a different microaggression. All of these are real, actually. All right. So, when you look at this scenario, what are some of the main microaggressions that you see coming out? Anybody? Ascription of intelligence. Why? I heard you say it right here. Why ascriptions? Say it again. They were surprised by how smart. Okay. All right. Anything else in there?
Actually, I took your myth of meritocracy and changed it to a myth of mediocrity.
Nice.
I was going to say outsider on your own campus or in your own department in this case.
Yeah? There's one more. Let's see. Who said that? Go ahead.
Different norming.
Yes.
Different norming.
Why?
Because there's one norm assigned to a particular group.
Cool. Were you gonna? Did you have another one? Yeah. Okay. Even if it's been taken, it's okay.
I think Eric not realizing how brilliant his coworker is goes to show that he doesn't pay attention and he's not very present. And I feel like a lot of these issues are people who are not present with you because you're a person of color. And I think one thing that happens to people of color is we get ignored a lot. That's really the fundamental issue, is we're always being ignored. And so when you are put on the spotlight, people start acting brand new, like they've never met you before.
Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely. In fact, I would add either ignored or hyper surveilled, and usually nothing in between. So how would you respond to this using that Raven approach? How would you redirect? Anybody? How would you, over here, how would you redirect? Again, with the intention of intervening, pulling aside, stopping the harm from continuing.
What did you expect?
Oh, yeah, that's a, so coming in, so you're going straight to the question, you're breaking it up. Like, right? I love it, that's good. What else? And while she's walking over there to put the mic, I think one thing that we have to remember is that oftentimes when these things occur, there's a sense of social awkwardness for us because we don't want to intervene, because if we do, it may come off as curt, it may disrupt the tone of the conversation, it may put us out there a little bit by doing so, but just remember that by not doing it, we're also causing further harm by letting it just go. So we have to basically realize that our privilege requires us to intercede.
I was just going to say that my only concern with that kind of response, because that's my initial response too, is to be kind of combative and put someone on the spot, is that has the potential to further embarrass Lewis,
yep.
Right? And
Agreed.
so I think instead of asking Eric, like, well, what did you expect, right? So that he has, like, he's maybe given an opportunity to articulate his racist ideas, it might be better to just counter them and be like, really, I wasn't surprised at all. I've come to expect that of Lewis, or something like that.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah.
Just to be the counter to that narrative.
Yes.
And make it not normal to
Yeah.
think that way. I don't know.
No, I totally agree. I think partly in terms of the intervention, it's going to depend upon the level of severity of the moment. So obviously I'm reading this, but you'd have to gauge in the moment. My guess is that for most of the cases, you're going to want to go with the option that you had, because what you want to do is to help enlighten them without basically making them shut down. If it is said in a super egregious way, which of course you could read this in the even more egregious way depending upon the tonality, then I would actually probably go with the stronger intercession, especially if I felt like it was very directed and very obvious. So, I mean, I guess what I'm saying is, you respond based upon the situation, the level of response. Okay, what about asking questions, values, clarification, anybody? Or emphasizing thoughts and feelings, next steps, any of that?
Yeah, we were talking about saying something along the lines of, wow, I'm uncomfortable with what you just said because it's important for me that every member of our library faculty be held in respect. I mean, we all worked our butts off to get here, and I don't understand why you wouldn't think Lewis could do something like explain the computer use policy.
You're like, it's just the computer use policy. Yeah, that's the most magnificent policy I've ever seen. Okay, so we're not going to go through examples. I'm not going to do them as a group. I just wanted to read you one more for you to think about as you go. Frank is an African-American student in his early 50s and a veteran who has recently returned to college. He went to the bookstore to purchase books and supplies. After standing in line for a few minutes, Frank was the next customer in line. The clerk looked past him and asked the student behind Frank, "May I help you?" Frank said, "Excuse me, sir, I was next in line." The clerk responded by saying, "I'm sorry, sir, I didn't realize you were standing here for purchase. I'll get to you next." Unhappy with the situation, Frank walked to the counter and said, "I'm sorry, sir, but I've waited in line like everybody else. I need to be served now." The clerk replied, "Sir, you need to calm down or I'll be forced to call campus police." Now, as I said, all of these are real examples of real things that have occurred. And in fact, I just dealt with a very similar situation, but it was a faculty member saying this to a student, that they were going to call campus police on them because literally they were standing in the parking structure. Yes, standing in the parking structure. There were like 30 open spaces, but they wanted to park right there where they were standing with their friends talking. So they pulled up, honked their horn, got out, refused, and then basically said if they didn't get out of the way, they were going to call the police on them. Right? So, but those things happen at every institution. We have to remember that there are people who will simply believe that some people don't belong at this institution, and so we have to keep those things in mind. So it's incumbent upon us to respond. Redirect, ask questions, values clarification, emphasizing our thoughts and feelings, and talking about what next steps might be. So for you, for your homework, and for what I hope will take place in your respective units, you have these scenarios here, and I also have after this slide, there's another few scenarios, plus some role play ones that we'll be passing on. I hope that you will engage them and really start to think about how can we engage in practicing to respond in situations when too many of us oftentimes don't. It's a key to success, but it's also important for, again, retraining our minds so that as we're engaging all these structural changes that are taking place, that we're doing so from a standpoint that's focused on equity, inclusion, and diversity, and not focused solely on ourselves. Thank you.